Hello.
Hi, Imani.
Hi, Drew. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. I'm going to just take a moment to brag a little bit because people may not know we don't only share Harvard. We share a high school alma mater, Concord Academy, where we both served as senior class presidents. And there is something, and so I am often bragging that that Drew attended Concord Academy. I've been doing so for many years. And there is, this book is extraordinary. And it is really, it's a personal history, but it is a history of mid-century. And it is a history of what it meant to come of age as a woman, as a girl and a woman in mid-century. And there's this one portion, there's one sentence that just, it stays with me. And you're talking about your mother, and you say, she thought it her obligation to teach me to be a lady, complete with the simultaneous privilege and subordination that destiny entailed. And it resonated so powerfully, with me, because it encapsulates something about your work as a historian. And then it brought something that you observed about Southern womanhood, Southern elite white womanhood in particular, but also it becomes this opening to this extraordinary journey that you took and the ways in which you made different choices than those that were placed before you.
Imani, what an amazing way to start, because you've just gotten to the heart of the matter, and it makes me realize what I knew already, what a privilege it is to be up here with you. So thank you for taking this task on. I, too, have been very proud to say that I went to Concord Academy, which is where Imani Perry. So we can be a cheering squad for Concord Academy. This question of combined privilege and subordination is, I think, at the heart of the whole book, because it's about growing up in a privileged family in Virginia in the era of segregation, where I was on top of the hierarchy in many ways because I was white and because my family was prosperous, well off. But I realized early on that I was also not at the top of the heap, because my mother constantly said to me, it's a man's world, sweetie, and the sooner you figure that out, the better off you'll be. So I saw this odd configuration of what it meant to have advantages in one area, disadvantages in another area, that made me aware very early on of the larger world around me, beyond my family, beyond the demands that I be a lady within the context of what it meant to be a girl with 3 brothers. I had to, be prim and proper, and they did not. I had to wear little lace panties, which drove me crazy, and I refused to wear. And so I was in open revolt about that. But then when I looked around me, I could see much more profound issues of lack of privilege, subordination, segregation, the racial dynamics of the community in which I grew up. And I think I grew up with this notion, it's not fair in my mind, which is what I'd say to my mother when she said I had to do something and my brothers didn't. But then I realized there was a much broader world that was much more unfair that became evident to me pretty early on.
And the way that, I just, in terms of the way it resonated with me as a reader, that, because you're talking about gender and you're talking about race and you're talking about class, but some of those impositions of expectations about what it meant to be a lady immediately resonated. What was appropriate, what wasn't inappropriate, and that feeling of resistance. And I wonder if you could talk about your relationship with your mother very honestly and also tenderly about you were very different you're really academically oriented, you're resistant to the idea about what it meant to be a lady, and you found yourself at odds. And that in some ways becomes this launching pad for the rest of your journey, right?
Very much so. And for the book, I'm glad you used that word tenderly, because I came to something of a reckoning in the course of writing this book. My mother died when I was 19 years old, and she died looking back, we should have all realized how ill she was, but we just sort of didn't pay attention. And so her death was in some ways very sudden. She died on Christmas Eve, 1966. She was 48 years old. And I'd had a giant fight with her just a few days before about whether I could go see a friend of mine who happened to be male and also black in Connecticut before. I just said I was going to do this before I came home from college. And she said, no, you're not. I have to have a letter from their parents. I said, what? What century are you in? And so I just defied her and went off. And so we never resolved that fight. And our relationship from the time of the little lace panties on was a fight. And as I began to write this and think about her life and the kind of impositions on her, constraints on her, the sense she had, being a generation older than me, of an even narrower path of choice for young women. She was never much educated. I think looking back, she probably had dyslexia or something. She was a terrible student, really never finished high school. And I was this little assiduous A-getter who was always top of her class and always tried to be completely rational. And I'd argue with her in syllogisms and say, this is the way it ought to be. And she'd just say, you're going to do what I say because I'm your mother. And so this conflict was never fixed or entirely addressed before she died. But as I went back into her life and portrayed it, I felt empathy for her, understanding of her, and maybe this was an act of reconciliation.
Yeah.
If it came out that I was tender towards her, maybe that happened. Maybe I achieved that in the course of writing the book.
It did. It was and also honest. Yeah, it's funny. So I saw your brother in Richmond a few months ago.
Oh,
we had
my older brother.
Yeah, and we had a long conversation. and he's
my older brother's a character.
Yes,
we can talk about that. Was he a character?
Yes.
What did he say? She's never told me this before, so here we go. Okay.
And he had this sort of twinkle in his eye, and he said, "Drew is stubborn." And I thought about that. You have a section where you talk about. There's sort of successive waves. You talk about Concord Academy, and and you talk about the sort of the storied Mrs. Halls, the headmistress, and also Mrs. Mendenhall, who was still teaching when I was there.
Did she teach
English. She did not teach me. I didn't have her for English, but I saw her all the time, Sylvia Mendenhall. But as a place that had a kind of proto-feminist element, but also still had conservatism about so you could do more as a girl than perhaps in other spaces. It was okay to be smart, but you still had to be a lady, right? I mean, and then Bryn Mawr to another, and that's the place where you really start to push against the constraints of where you're like, where I read it as that's the feminist institutional space, but it wasn't. We think about those schools as actually necessarily feminist, but they weren't. They were sort of the women there were threading a needle, right, between taking up more space, but also not wanting to disturb the larger social order. Would that be fair? Yeah.
Yes, I think two elements, absolutely right. When I went off to Concord Academy, I hadn't just turned 13. It was 2 days before my 13th birthday. So I got sent up to New England to this boarding school. And it saved my life in many ways because it took intellectual young women seriously. It was an all-girls school. Was it an all-girls school when you were there? It had become co-ed.
The girls still ran everything when I was
That's good. That's good to hear. I'm glad that lingered on. And here was a place that said, we're going to challenge you. We think you're smart. We think you can do whatever you want with your brain. And I was surrounded by all these very strong women who ran the place, most notably the unforgettable head of the school, Mrs. Hall, who did things like drive a tractor around and build a skating rink, and together with a couple of other faculty members, take apart an old meeting house in New Hampshire and bring it board by board down to Concord, Massachusetts, and reassemble it. And there's a picture of her on a ladder with a hammer putting the chapel together. And so we felt, my goodness, this woman can do whatever she puts her mind to. And that was a message to watch. We saw in her behavior a message. But she also spoke to us maybe twice or three times a week at assemblies with excellent speeches. I think that she was a combination of Socrates and General Patton. But these speeches were about what lives we should live and what our moral compass should be and what our values should be. But also, she collected a group of them in a book and called it Ladies Be Ladies. So this whole notion of be strong, be all these things that I'm showing you can be, but then a language and a rhetoric that didn't embrace that said, you won't do anything important in life ultimately except serve your husband and help him out in his career. So don't get ideas that are too big, but here I am on my tractor, get out of the way. And so it was very much a confusing message, but for me, ultimately a liberating one. I was taken very seriously. She challenged me various times and said, you can do better than that at whatever I was trying to do. And so I went off to another women's school, Bryn Mawr College, where that was run by women too. It was almost entirely a world of women. I sometimes wonder what would have happened had I gone to Radcliffe. I know there's some Radcliffe alums in this audience where I would never have encountered a woman professor in 4 years of college.
Right.
Bryn Mawr was filled with them. So I think I began to be able to imagine a path imitating those women, following those women, being like those women. But Bryn Mawr had its own shortcomings in terms of feminism because it told us we could do anything, but we could do anything because we were so extraordinary. And it never challenged the overarching restrictions on women in our society. We were going to just move beyond them because we were special. But other women would be left in the subordinate positions. They didn't say it quite that explicitly, but that was the implicit message.
Just I want to ask more questions about the details, but there's this wonderful moment where you describe ending parietals, which I don't know if people necessarily know. I know what parietals were because we still had them at Concord Academy and I was there, but the rules about gender and dormitories, right?
Yep.
You tell your daughter that you ended parietals and she's like, what are parietals?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think there's an important message in this. So we had rules about when we could have to be in at night, and we couldn't be in men's dorms, and the men couldn't be in our dorms unless the doors were open and 3 feet were on the floor,
right.
and just all these rules. And they were collectively known as parietals. And as head of student government in my senior year, I undertook a campaign to get rid of them all. And we actually succeeded. And so that was the end of parietals. And at one point, I was bragging to my daughter, who's now, 42. She was, I think, going off to college. Yeah. And I said, well, I got rid of parietals at Bryn Mawr College. And she looked at me blankly and said, what are parietals? So the trivial nature of this accomplishment, I sort of always knew on one level. And she underscored it. But she underscored something very important, I think, about my generation. And I wonder... You're 10 years younger than me? 12? I don't know exactly, but about that. I don't want to make you older than you are.
I'm 51. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Almost 20 years younger than me. Okay. We'll go for that.
Yeah.
But I feel as if our generation made some changes that were so profound they became invisible.
Yes.
That no one ever knew we made them. People your age probably, well, you had them at Concord maybe, but let's say your kids.
Right, no, they would have
no idea. What?
They would think it was
you had
bizarre.
to wear skirts to class?
Yes,
you had to come in at 2 a.m? That's insane.
Yeah.
But it's a tribute to our success that no one even remembers they existed. And I think look beyond parietals as you think about that with the poor, abused baby boomers and what we did remove and change that has been naturalized.
Yeah.
So no one recognizes what it was like. And that's part of why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to say, you people who are still alive and will be alive long after me have to understand what that era was like for women, for African Americans, for everybody, actually.
I mean, and it's very clear in multiple ways. I mean, you talk about traveling with the American Friends Service Committee through Europe and then also through the South, and those experiences too, right? What it was like in the midst of the Cold War to go to Germany, what it's like to actually try to navigate the landscape of the South in the context of the Civil Rights Movement, and actually, even as someone who was raised in the South, in intimate quarters with Black people, but actually opening up a different set of conversations in the midst of that part of the movement that is not the part of the movement that we necessarily see, you know? I mean, Quakers did something special, right?
So I got involved with the Quakers completely by accident because I found a flyer at my school that was advertising a Quaker venture to Eastern Europe that was meant to unite young people across the Iron Curtain and help advance peace by having students and young people from behind the Iron Curtain and from the United States speak with one another. And this was very resonant for me when I picked it up because I just lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis that had happened in the fall of my junior year. And a group of my friends and I sat in a classroom. I'm sure the classroom's still there. You probably took classes in it. One night, the classes were over, but we all went in, just sat on the desk. We were talking to each other about how our lives might end the next day. And was the world going to come to an end? And what would we most miss not having experienced if the world ended the next day? And you could say, teenage girls can be slightly hysterical. We were not being hysterical, actually. I mean, what's been revealed about the Cuban Missile Crisis in detailed analyses in the years since is that we came very close to the brink. But that made me so anxious about what the Cold War meant and what I could do to bring peace that when I saw this flyer, I said, I have to do this. So off I went to Eastern Europe with this Quaker group. And the group was remarkable for me, not just because it was so unlike the kinds of people I'd grown up with, but also because it was a time that I lived in complete equality and community with African Americans. And I had always been around African Americans, but they had been in roles like housekeepers and laborers on the farms or in the gardens in Virginia. And this was a completely different experience with some very accomplished young Black people, including one of the 9 people who integrated the Atlanta schools the year before. And so these were inspiring people as well. And that was a pretty enlightening summer for me and led me the next summer to, under the auspices of the same group, undertake a summer in the South working in civil rights sites that the Quakers had been involved with, once again with young people. Orangeburg, South Carolina, Birmingham, Alabama, where you grew up. I just went back there last month. Yep. Yeah. And Prince Edward County, Virginia, and so forth. So
all really historic. And one of the things that's so wonderful is that it's a very personal book, but all of the locations are these incredibly historically significant sites, and you weave the social history in, which is not surprising that you would do that very well as a historian, but it's pretty remarkable. You were in some amazing places.
I was, and it was the summer of 1964, and so the day we were leaving, we had an orientation at a friend's house, Friends, capital F, Quaker organization house in Washington, D.C., and the day we gathered for our orientation meeting was the day that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney disappeared, the 3 civil rights workers who were in Mississippi for Freedom Summer. And so a kind of theme the whole summer was what happened to them. Will they be found? And just towards the end of the summer, they were found, and they'd been shot and likely tortured. And certainly James Cheney, the African-American member of the trio, was brutally tortured and castrated. And so all summer we kept thinking, what happened to them? How scary is this situation in the South? And so it had a kind of alerting effect, I would say, in which made us very aware of some of the things that were at stake and why they mattered so much and why we really felt as a group coming closer and closer together as we undertook this journey. In all the places that we were in Prince Edward County, in Orangeburg, and in Birmingham, we stayed with families of African-American civil rights activists, usually with families that had young people our age. And I remember, for example, the family I stayed with in Orangeburg the 9-year-old had been arrested 11 times or something like that. So these were families who had really put their lives on the line. And just a Birmingham story. I was in Birmingham with a Harvard group last month, and I walked into the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and I was handed a note from Olivia Woolfolk.
Oh, yes.
She didn't hand it, the guard handed it to me. And she said, I read your book, I loved your book, and I thought you might like to know the person you refer to in the book as Cookie, who you stayed with in the summer of 1964, is Denise Bearfield Pendleton. Here's her address. She's hoping to hear from you. And so I had not heard from them for 50 years. I describe how her father, who was a doctor, lay on the floor with a rifle pointed out the window because so many houses in his neighborhood had been bombed. Yeah. And he told us about that. Their neighbor was one of the little girls who'd been killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church. And Cookie and I had long conversations about, what civil rights meant, what it meant to her to be in this family that was risking so much. But I just completely lost track of her until I wrote to her after I got that note and heard back from them. And it just, some of the things that this book has brought back to my life as people have encountered it. Anyway, my little Birmingham sidebar.
That's such a gift.
Isn't that great?
It's great, and it's also, one of as you're recounting, it's so vivid and visceral, these moments, and I love that you give us a sense as readers of actually how you experience, fear or trepidation or trying to figure out what are your thoughts about these things politically, and the approach that you think is the best approach to take, because it's as though we're there with you as a young woman, like moving through these questions. And I wonder if we could shift a little bit to Bryn Mawr, because one of the things that I've found really moving is your talk about the complexity of it as a sort of age, in some sense, of the social revolution, right? So that so much is opening up, and it's sort of the more freedom for young women, but there's also people are falling apart, and struggling, and that's not a story that we get that much of what it was like as the society opened up, and the the anti-war move, all these things, the early feminist movement. Can you talk a little bit about? Yeah,
there's a part in the book where I say being a college student 64 to 68 was like being on a precipice, because the world was blowing up in ways that undermined basic assumptions. We had the sexual revolution, we had the anti-Vietnam War protests that became increasingly violent as my college years unfolded, and as many in the anti-war movement got more and more frustrated about the lack of attention to this anti-war voice. And you also had the civil rights movement, which was moving from the Martin Luther King leadership to the Black Power movement, where people thought, how do I relate to this? This was so important. This is me, actually. Yeah. How do I relate to this? This was so important to me, but white folks like me don't really belong here anymore. I think what I did was get involved in Vietnam stuff. Yes. But a lot of this behavior was just unthinkable. You didn't go march off onto Washington. And, now people do it at the drop of a hat. Right. But this was seen as shocking. My parents, I never told them. I went to Selma my freshman year, never told my family about it. I had to tell my English teacher because I really messed up my big English paper, and he had a few words about it.
It's great detail when you talk about it. It's just because it's so much like being a young person. You're like, yes.
Okay, I'll come back to that. Yeah. But it was a scary time. And I have a paragraph where I talk about a lot of the things that happened to young people I knew. Abortion was, of course, illegal. And birth control was just about impossible to get. So young women would get pregnant. I had friends who had illegal abortions, came back to their dorm bleeding. We didn't know whether to take them to the hospital and risk their getting arrested, or just take care of them in the dorm and risk having them die. This was, this happened on more than one occasion in my experience, so I'm sure a lot more. Then it was also a time of drugs, of people beginning to experiment, not just with marijuana, but LSD, other kinds of drugs. And bad trips, scary business for lots of people. And I had friends who dropped out of school because they got so involved with this drug culture. It was also the era of the draft, and young men that we knew at Haverford College, the kind of co-college, male college with Bryn Mawr, were trying to figure out, were they going to go to Canada? Were they going to be draft resistors? Were they going to go to jail? Mm-hmm. Were they going to go to Vietnam and die? These seem extraordinarily consequential questions. And the list of options I just gave you, I know young men who did each of those things. And then the removal of restrictions on women as it became more intense and we became more liberated and welcomed that freedom. There weren't the expectations, supports around us in a sense. I think now there's counseling, there are places you can go, there are things you can do. I had a friend at Bryn Mawr who was a couple of classes behind me, and she fell in love with this very charismatic, sociopathic guy at Penn who was very much a leader of the left at Penn. Mm-hmm. And he was evil. And she disappeared, and she was found chopped up in pieces in a trunk in his apartment. Now, that, in a sense, you could say it's a price of her freedom to make those choices, to make those relationships, to have the countercultural realities all around us. But a lot of people had very dangerous experiences and sometimes tragic experiences. Another friend of mine, anti-war activist, became a Weather Underground person and disappeared for a number of years. She then reemerged and made some kind of deal, I guess, with the judicial system. And she and I have been reunited because of this book. We had this long conversation this fall about why she became violent and I didn't, and what the choices were. But that was a very upsetting life for a while for her to have to negotiate all of that. Another Bryn Mawr student blew up a house in Greenwich Village trying to make a bomb a couple of years after she graduated from Bryn Mawr in anti-war. She was part of the Weather Underground. So all these ways in which the 60s could become disastrous for young people, even as they became so liberating for so many of us. And I had a very illuminating conversation with the dean who was trying to deal with all of this at Bryn Mawr. She said to me how terrifying it was for her. She just never knew what was going to happen next to one of the students that she was responsible for. And so that was a difficult time. But then you asked me about something. Oh, my English paper.
Yes, in Selma, yes.
So I went off to Selma with my boyfriend because I watched Bloody Sunday on television and said, this is not America. If I don't do something now, how will I live with myself for the rest of my life? When I saw John Lewis getting his head bashed in because he wanted the right to vote. So my boyfriend and I got in a car and drove to Selma to participate in the march that happened after that original Bloody Sunday march. And there are stories to tell about that, but I had to skip this big English paper, or I didn't skip it. I wrote a draft and gave it to my roommate, who said she'd type it. So she typed it. That was more than one. This is, okay, technology. Right. I couldn't write it on the computer. Right. I wrote it out by hand and then typed it. So she typed it, but she didn't proofread it. And my English professor was horrified, and I, being a pack rat, kept his comments that he wrote on this paper, and I included them in here, and his despair and dismay at what my English paper had turned out to be, and he could sympathize with my decision to go to Selma, but, right. And then he goes on and on and on and on. And one person who reviewed this book said it was shocking to see the tone of these comments, and I thought, that's kind of what life was like in those days, right? Mm-hmm. Did you get comments like that at Concord? Probably you never wrote a paper like that. You would have never gotten comments like that.
No, I did write some. I mean, I made some decisions. It's a different era, but there's still similar moments of some bad choices. But I mean, or good choices. But I mean, I think that I actually thought it was really. It's one of those moments where you remember, though, that all of those kind of significantly historic moments entailed a kind of analysis about choices that did have, and some of them were huge, and some of them were like, So we read stories about the people who wound up dropping out of school. Like there's a series of choices that they're the minutia of daily life, and we hear the stories of that period that don't include daily life. Right, which are things like turning papers, right?
Yeah. I really wanted daily life in here, and choice seems to me exactly how I wanted to approach this book, which is I'm not representative of anything in particular. I'm a person who has had a variety of experiences, but I wanted to situate them in the context of what were the choices that were available to me as a woman, as a good student, as a this is that, all the things I was, so that, as you said a little earlier, and I was so pleased you said it, that it was intended to illuminate more than just me, the kind of context within which I moved through the world. And that's through that mechanism of what were the choices available to me or not available to me.
Right.
I mean, strikingly, I found many more choices available than my mother and grandmother did.
Absolutely.
And that made all the difference in my life.
Yeah. The title. John Lewis. Can you talk about why necessary trouble, and also the story of how you talked to him about before he departed about that? Yeah.
So I got to know John Lewis when I was president of Harvard, and he came and gave a talk at Harvard, and I just had idolized him my whole life, really, since that Bloody Sunday moment when I saw him sacrifice so much for the right to vote. And so he and I began to get to know each other a bit, and I asked him if he would come speak when Harvard, when we took down, or we put up a plaque with the names of 4 enslaved people who had lived and worked in the Harvard president's house in the 18th century. And so he came and made that dedication just an unforgettable day, maybe the most unforgettable day of my presidency. Everyone in that crowd was weeping, and it just meant so much to start to deal with the legacy of slavery on Harvard's campus. And over the years, we communicated about this and that. And then I asked if he would come and give the commencement address at my last commencement as president. And so he stands up and begins and he said, yes, he'd be honored to do so. And he begins his address and turns to me and says, Madam President, thank you for making necessary trouble. You know his phrase, good trouble, necessary trouble. And he referred to something I had done as a kid, writing to Eisenhower to support integration at age 9, and shocked my parents, and was kind of one of the early stages of my being rebellious and, in my father's words, impossible.
And the letter is in the book. Yes,
I retrieved the letter from the Eisenhower Library, so you can see the facsimile of it. And so when he said that, I was just, what could be better than having him thank me for making necessary trouble? And when I started writing this book, I realized that that phrase captured so much of the purpose and direction of the book, in that I was seen to be a very difficult, impossible child. My father would say, why be difficult when you can be impossible? That was something he would repeat to me. And when I thought about it, I thought, I did these things because they were necessary for me to survive. And the kind of causes I got involved with, the commitments I got engaged with, they really were a necessity for me. And so I thought Necessary Trouble would be the perfect title for this book, but I have to ask John Lewis if it's okay. And so about 2 months before he died, I had a phone call with him and asked him if it would be all right if I used the phrase as a title. And he, being the extraordinarily gracious and warm person that he was, said, of course, he would be honored. Please go ahead and use that as a title. And so it's a title both because it's the right title, but also a bit of an homage to John Lewis, who needs no homage. You know, it would be presumptuous to say I want to honor him because his life honors him so much. But insofar as it's possible to do so, I hope that title says what his life meant to me and what I think it means to anybody who wants to be, or should mean to anybody who wants to think about what it means to be an American in this day and age, and to be a human
beautiful.
being too.
Yeah.
What a remarkable man.
What am I? And you are remarkable.
Oh,
I mean, just questions. We have some time for questions. There's a microphone over here.
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
I'm grateful to have seen you today, heard you today, and I'm sitting here next to my mother. The thing that really struck me of so many things was what you mentioned about your daughter. And I will say that she may not know about the dormitory and all the work that you did, but I can tell you by just you seeing her and raising her and empowering her in which the manner that you have, she is a person, a woman like me, who will advocate, who will fight, who will not just be silent. And that's all started because of, the stories she shares and the stories that you've shared in your book. So I just wanted to tell you, you've made an amazing, indelible impression upon your daughter, I'm sure. So thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that.
This isn't about your book, but about your career, where you have been a historian, actually participated in history in Selma and elsewhere, also been a university president. And we're living in a time when the teaching of history is under attack. Merely being sensitive to difference of opinion is under attack. So can you speak to the role of academia and based on your experience relative to your life's experience?
Well, I won't just speak on behalf of academia. I think I would speak on behalf of all of us as citizens when I say we cannot ban history. We cannot distort history. If we don't understand where we came from and the trials and tribulations that we have gone through and the ones that we have yet to go through and the questions we have not fully answered and still need to answer, the injustices that we have tried to address but not entirely succeeded in addressing, we have to devote ourselves to continuing that work. And history is what gives us the depth beyond our own individual experience and the experience of this moment. We can't just live in this moment. We have to live as the inheritors of the past that we actually are, whether we acknowledge it or not. And we have to live with a responsibility of the past to the future that comes through us as individuals. So I know this wonderful book festival has talked a lot about the banning of books. There are a lot of people wearing T-shirts about don't ban books. We've got to figure out what we can do individually together as a movement to make sure that rigorous historical instruction continues from grade school up and that the books that tell those stories are available to students and to people who are well beyond their school years as well. So let's say that this book festival has left us reinforced in our commitment to books and the history that is told in books and elsewhere.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry. My fault.
I'm sorry. I just coincidentally finished reading Mothers of Invention, your amazing book about from the diaries and the letters of the women of the South during the Civil War, that you got all that together. And this may be an unfair question, but what was the most amazing thing you remember about that? Because it blew me away reading all that.
About that book?
About that book, about what these women were writing about, the history that you found out from these women who we don't hear about that otherwise. It was fascinating.
This is a book that for those of you who have not had the pleasure of reading it, it's a book I wrote published in the mid-90s about slaveholding women in the South during the Civil War. And the core of the book is the problem of being asked to take up a lot of responsibility that these women hadn't had to assume before the war, but then their husbands go away, and it's partially liberating, but mostly not. and the terror of having to manage the enslaved people on plantations and farms was shocking to many of these women, and just led them to have to ask all kinds of questions about what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a privileged white woman? What does slavery mean? What does this war mean? And the stories and the eloquence of many of these women I found very engaging. And I think probably the story that resonates most with me is a horrible one. And I remember when I was reading the manuscripts, which were at the University of Texas, I was sitting there doing research in a manuscript library there. And it's about a slaveholding woman named Lizzie Neblett, whose husband goes off to war. And she has to manage a small slaveholding. She has about 15 enslaved people on the farm. And she doesn't know how to do it. And so she beats one person just mercilessly because she thinks that's how she can control slavery. And it's just so cruel and horrible. And she herself finds herself being cruel and horrible. And so the dilemmas and horror of what that slave system was come through so clearly at that moment of threat and transition that the war introduced. So that wasn't a very cheerful one to put front and center, but it was probably the one that just left me aghast and really so deeply troubled by that story and the person of it.
And I just say really, it's a you won't say this, but it's a really transformative book in the history of the 19th century and the history of the Civil War. I mean, I just want to add that it's a groundbreaking book. Okay.
Well, thank you, Imani.
Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to know whether or not, you and I and everyone else here, we know that there are different treatments depending on the gender, second-class citizenship and primary citizenship. So you, as in a very successful and achieved female, do you still receive second-class citizenship? Do you view yourself being treated as a second-class citizen in the U.S.?
That's such an interesting question. Certainly not at the level of being a second-class citizen, but sometimes people I guess the music's starting. But people respond to me in gendered ways sometimes. Certainly when I became president of Harvard, one of the things I found so amusing was people kept saying, she's too nice to be president of Harvard. And I just thought, just you wait, just you wait. I'm really nice when I fire people, I can be nice. And just these gendered expectations that surrounded my presidency. And I think there's still often gendered ways that I find myself being treated, but at this point in my life, they more amuse me. It's how other people are being treated that concerns me a great deal more than any kind of small insult I might receive.
Can we join me in another round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, you're so kind.